All right, guys, let's roll. Chapter 21 IDs for college history. We're talking about the 1920s this time. This is a chapter, again, like chapter 20 that we've already covered, but I wanted to make sure that we go back over some of this stuff since, it's going to have been a little bit since we've talked about it. I want to give you something to reference back to. As far as the IDs, the big thing that we're talking about in the 1920s is the economy and some of the things that went a little wrong, went a little overboard in the economy in the 1920s that helped lead to the Depression of the 1930s. One of those was quite simply overspending by people at first that led to underspending later on, and the growth of debt that went along with that overspending that then led to underconsumption later on. And some of that was done, that debt growing was done by installment plans. People, it just buy now, pay later. It was just a craze that started to happen in the 1920s. Installment plans with buy now, later schemes became a big, big deal in the 1920s. Your next one is oligopolies. Now, oligopolies, a lot of this comes from this means an economic sector that's dominated by a few businesses. Why did this come about? Well, largely World War One. The United States government was able to tell companies that we need this, this, and this, and we need this much of it, and we need to do all this. And companies say, fine, in return, you need to give us some real guarantees. You need to give us some big contracts. You need to give us some long-term guarantees. Antitrust laws were basically out the window during World War One, and so companies were allowed to grow into these big behemoths that really dominated major sectors of the industry. Once we got through the progressive era of the beginning of the 1900s, Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson, the country really got tired of progressivism, it seemed, for a while, and so they turned to three Republican presidents in the 1920s. The first two definitely conservative by that day's definition. The third one, Herbert Hoover, arguably conservative by that definition, really more technocratic. But the first one you're starting out with, Warren G. Harding. Now, Warren G. Harding from Ohio, certainly not the best president we've ever had. Not a really intellectually heavyweight. Warren Harding just was not a guy who was overly qualified to be president of the United States. He wasn't a bad person. He wasn't an evil person necessarily, but Warren Harding was naive, and he surrounded himself with people who took advantage of him. One of the people who took advantage of him was his interior secretary, who got in big trouble with something that was known as the Teapot Dome scandal. Teapot Dome was an area in Wyoming where there was some oil, and the interior secretary ended up overseeing the selling of federal lands and federal oil rights for his own personal gain. Not good. So Warren Harding really didn't do anything that bad as president. Warren Harding didn't do anything that good as president, but he did certainly allow a lot of corruption to happen around him. Warren Harding ended up dying in 1923, which led to the next president. He hadn't even made it through his first term yet. The next president took over, Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge had been the governor of Massachusetts before he was chosen as Harding's vice president. He got some of his notoriety by the way he handled the Boston police strike in 1919. Anyway, Coolidge takes over as president in 1923, then is elected president himself in 1924. Coolidge is all just, look, I am a person who is not here to run the country. I am here to facilitate things. He says, look, the chief business of the American people is business. My job is to make sure that business continues to run and that the American economy continues to move forward. One of the things that certainly revolutionized the United States of America in the 1920s was the automobile. Which automobile in particular? Of course, Henry Ford's Model T. The automobile allows people to go on vacations. It spurs all sorts of new industries. It spurs roads, it spurs highways, it spurs motels, gas stations, all the rest of this stuff. But it also changes where people live. It allows people to live outside of cities It allows the suburbs to grow, allows people to live in one spot, travel into work, and work in a completely different place, which never really had been an option for people with means before. The radio became a huge form of communication, not just communication for news purposes, not just for music to be played over the radio. It really was what TV would become later on. Entertainment shows were on the radio. People set their clocks by the radio. They listened to certain programs at certain times a day. Red Ryder and all the rest of them became real nationwide entertainment for people. Urbanization, yes, at the same time that rich people were able to move out of the center of cities, cities themselves and the suburbs surrounding them continued to grow in the process of urbanization. As the United States became even more and more and more of an industrialized country, you had a bigger section of the country that lived in and around cities than ever had before. Now, we're dealing with some of the after effects of that. Even today, every time something goes wrong, cities are going to have more of those issues. Cities can have more of those issues, and things can spread more quickly, including disease, like we're dealing with right now in cities than they can in rural areas. The Great Migration, a lot of people who moved to cities at this point had moved during World War I and even in the aftermath of World War I. The Great Migration refers to the Great Migration of African Americans from the rural South to the urban North, quite simply looking for jobs most of the time. Many of them were hoping that they would be able to escape prejudice, escape discrimination that they had faced in the South. Unfortunately for many of them, they found it just in different ways, in different forms in these northern cities. Flappers. Flappers, as you know, young, rebellious women, women who just didn't want to do what men had told them to do. They were tired of men telling them the way that they were supposed to live. They were told to wear long dresses, so they wore them up above their knees. They were told to wear long hair, so they bobbed it off. They were told not to smoke or drink in public, so they did it. They were told not to talk about their sexual relationships, so they did it. Really, here you see the second iteration of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. At first, the KKK had been something that really was just for the purpose of terrorizing Republicans in the South. Not only Black Americans, but anybody who was probable to vote Republican, the KKK wanted to go after them. This iteration of the KKK, notice here we're following the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, 1910s. You've seen a lot of immigration during that time period. And what this iteration of the KKK wants to do is really just reiterate their view that America was for white native-born Protestants, and they were against anybody who was not a white native-born Protestant at this point. America had all sorts of cultural battles at this point. And one of those was borne out in the Scopes trial, or what's commonly known as the Scopes monkey trial. What had happened was that the state of Tennessee had passed a law saying that Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was not going to be allowed to be taught in Tennessee public schools. So the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, decided that indeed they were going to search out and seek out someone who would purposely break this law, someone who would purposely break Tennessee's law against teaching evolution. They found that in a young science teacher named John Scopes. Clarence Darrow became the defense attorney that defended John Scopes for the ACLU. He was prosecuted by none other than at least three-time presidential loser, William Jennings Bryan. Scopes did end up being actually convicted of breaking Tennessee's law, and he had to pay $100. But the long-term implication was a little bit different. The long-term implication really ended up being that we no longer looked at religious fundamentalism the same. The arguments that William Jennings Bryan had to make in order to get John Scopes convicted made a lot of people look at religious fundamentalism and go, "You sure about that? Are you really believe all of those? Take all those things absolutely literally?" And so, even though William Jennings Bryan and the people who were prosecuting John Scopes won the battle, they didn't necessarily win the war. These next few really get into the entertainment and celebrity culture of the 1920s. Baseball became a huge deal. Baseball and boxing were entertainment for the masses in the 1920s. I tell people that many of you don't know the name of Mike Trout. Mike Trout is almost certainly the greatest baseball player in the world right now, and yet about everybody knows the name of Babe Ruth. And Babe Ruth played darn near 100 years ago. Babe Ruth was one of the very biggest celebrities of the 1920s, just completely reinvented the game of baseball, hit more home runs than anybody had ever thought about at that point. Babe Ruth hit 60 home runs in 1927. The 1927 New York Yankees are largely seen to be quite possibly the greatest baseball team of all time. And Babe Ruth became not just a great athlete, but a celebrity. Jack Dempsey, same thing, very famous boxer of the time. But quite possibly the greatest celebrity of the time was a guy who also became very famous in 1927, Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh was the first to fly a solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean, did it in about 33 and a half hours, flew the Spirit of St. Louis over. I mean, Lindbergh became the celebrity, hands down, no holds barred of the 1920s. He became the guy who was more famous than anybody else. Now, later on, Lindbergh would use his celebrity to become a very prominent member of the America First Committee that spoke out against the U.S. entry into World War II. Unfortunately, tied to this was a whole lot of not just pro-German, but anti-Semitist sentiment from Charles Lindbergh, which is a really unfortunate part of his legacy. Prohibition, of course, was tried and, of course, failed in the 1920s with the 18th Amendment. Remember, we're not prohibiting the consumption of alcohol. We're prohibiting the manufacture, the transport, and the sale of alcohol. Those three things are being prohibited, but it doesn't stop it. It doesn't stop it. And really what happens is that alcohol and the sale and transport of alcohol falls into the hands of the mob. And of course, the most famous mobster from Chicago, Illinois was going to be Al Capone. Al Capone, a guy who just went down in American lore as a mobster who said, look, you want to make it illegal? Fine. More money for me. More money for me. Meanwhile, in Upper Manhattan in New York City, you have the Harlem Renaissance going on. Renaissance, of course, meaning rebirth. Harlem, a largely black neighborhood in Upper Manhattan. What this is a rebirth of black culture, black art, black music, black writing. You have musicians like jazz trumpeter Louis Armstrong, like jazz pianist Duke Ellington, blues singers like Bessie Smith. You have great poets like the Missourian Langston Hughes. Writing poems like A Dream Deferred, writing poems like I Too, with acknowledging that things aren't the way that he wants them to be right now, but with hope that things will possibly get better tomorrow. This really brought about what became a distinctly American form of music, in jazz music. Jazz music and blues music then would combine really to epitomize black music in the United States, which would develop into certain forms of rock and roll, which would then develop later on into certain forms of rap and hip hop. But jazz music is this quintessentially American black version of music that really became later popular even among white audiences. Late in the 1920s, 1928, Herbert Hoover's elected president of the United States. He's a Republican. He's seen by many as a conservative, but again, he's not really a conservative. Herbert Hoover's a technocrat. He had run the Food Administration during World War I. He was an engineer. He thought that he could tinker around with any problem. He did. He tried to tinker around with many different problems. One of the things when he started to see the issues that were starting to bring on the Great Depression, one of the things he asked Congress to do was to pass the Hawley-Smoot Tariff, which he signed. It turned out to be a very, very bad idea, which basically cut down world trade by about 40%. Certainly caused just irreparable harm to the economy. Herbert Hoover didn't just leave the economy alone and let things happen like they were going to, as is commonly thought. Instead, he did a lot of tinkering, and it didn't work quite so well. Black Tuesday is the day, October 29th, 1929, where the stock market crashed. Many people point to this and they say, look, this is the day that the Great Depression started. I disagree with that. What really happened early in 1930 is that the economy started to recover again. It's not like the stock market crash caused and began the Great Depression. It correlated with it. It certainly didn't help things. But it's not like all of the nation's wealth was bound up in the stock market. It certainly wasn't. We could have recovered from that. However, it really is the signal of, okay, this is when things are starting to go downhill. Another couple of things that you want to see here at the end of the chapter 21 IDs have to do with the aftermath of World War I and the lead up to World War II. There was a meeting, the Washington Naval Conference in the 1920s, and one of the things that came out of this whole idea was an international agreement known as the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Basically, what they tried to do with the Kellogg-Briand Pact was to outlaw war. They really thought that we just have to get rid of war in the world, that World War I had been so terrible that they thought, surely we can get to the point where we just won't do this anymore. It may seem like a pipe dream to us today. It seems like a pipe dream to us. You go, okay, fine, you want to outlaw war. How exactly are you going to enforce this? How are you going to enforce an outlawing of war? What are you going to do? Go to war with the people? It just doesn't, when you start to think of it like that, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. War debts and reparations. When you start to see the onset of the Great Depression at the beginning of the 1930s, even the end of the 1920s, what you realize is that it's made even worse in Europe because of the war debts and reparations that Germany still owed. Germany's war debts and reparations had been going to France, to Great Britain. When Germany is not able to pay those, Britain and France then are not able to pay back money that they had been lent by the United States. And really you get this whole vicious cycle. Things just got real ugly real fast in the United States and throughout the world. If you have any questions, let me know. These are the Chapter 21 IDs for you.